All right, I promised the 10-minute Cobb and Elder, and we'll see how close I can keep it to actual 10 minutes. One of the things I want you to have in front of you and just pull down is that notes document I put up. It may be more in depth than you need to understand what's going on here, but I would rather have you have it than not. It's about 2.5 pages, but I think it'll give you a good context, and if I happen to skip over something, you'll know where that goes. So the Cobb and Elder piece is now a fairly old one. It's from 1971 in terms of some of the stuff we'll read this semester. And the main idea really focuses on what is it that we're doing here in the study of policy and politics if all we do is say, hey, a bunch of elite people make decisions. And it focuses a lot on traditional democratic theory. And traditional democratic theory is, in a nutshell, this idea that citizens should be informed, we all read, we all talk to one another about issues, and then we tell our representatives or we vote ourselves on those issues in an informed and somewhat impassioned way. But that's never truly existed. It's existed in parts, in different ways, over time, but whether it's ever truly existed even within the United States is still kind of a fundamental question. So one of the things that Cobb and Elder are attacking is that when we do this, when we talk about traditional democratic theory, we're never going to meet that standard, and so we're actually researching things that don't really matter, and we're just describing the situation as it is rather than what it should be or how change happens. So they say that an elitist theory of democracy has emerged, and it suggests that the political elite is more important than the everyday political citizen. This then makes the continuation of stability the hallmark of our system. So this is where that status quo comes in. And so people don't participate. There's low levels of participation. And when we're just talking about elites, it's like, yeah, well, that's fine. Not everybody has to participate. But when we're talking about what should be on the agenda, we should be talking about why people are not participating. And so the problem becomes that this notion of elite politics restricts the types of issues or conflicts that actually exist within the system from ever becoming discussed within the system. And so they say that this limited participation is a problem. They actually say it presents a threefold crisis. There's a prescriptive crisis, meaning that we say that normative democratic theory, traditional democratic theory, should be an informed, involved citizen. But our modern interpretation is just saying, well, it's acceptable if only a few people pay attention. So we're kind of rationalizing what goes on rather than doing anything about it. The second is a crisis of relevance. It provides actual no guidelines for social change or direction for political action. And so conflicts in social movements are seen as kind of aberrations, one-offs, rather than the norm of how issues become policy. And then there's a crisis, they say, for research guidance, because what we're researching isn't actually what's interesting. What we end up researching is what elites do. And what they argue, and they did influence largely a lot of research that came after this, is we should be looking at what doesn't happen and why it doesn't happen. So what they say is what should be studied here and what should be talked about and what is the relevant point is agenda setting. Agenda setting is an alternative view of how politics works. It's not just policy. This is where the fundamental rubber meets the road here. How policy gets made and how we should give it attention. So they give us these 4 observations that are observed by what they call the democratic theorists, but I would say by just the general layperson sometimes too. 4 observations that are acknowledged, but they are tended not to be developed in any real way. The first is that the distribution of influence and access to the system has inherent biases built into it. The second is that because of this, the range of issues that will be considered is really restricted. Because, first of all, the attention of any organization is fairly limited. But, and Sydney pointed this out in class, organizations have a bias in favor of the exploitations of certain types of bias. Once you're in power, you want to retain power. And so therefore, you don't want anything to disrupt that. So you're going to push away anything that has that disruptive element. 3, the system has this inertia, this kind of slow to move, slow to change mentality that makes it extremely difficult to change any sort of policy or prevailing bias. And this determines what issues and alternatives are viewed as legitimate. If you are not viewed as a legitimate group, and if you do not have power, it makes it that much harder to change policy. Not only do you not have power within the system, but the system has the legal system backing it up, right? And the legal system is designed to reinforce that bias. So when those in power, Cobb and Elder say, call for, and they use this term, law and order, it's not only a desire for peace and stability, but it can also be what they call a bargaining ploy to protect their own advantage over those who don't have legitimacy in the system. So this is the point at which they say that those who do not have legitimacy, those groups or individuals who are not viewed as favored within the organization, within government, may have to resort to violence or threats to have their concerns even heard. And they say that even if it doesn't work, it may help shift the agenda, but it certainly doesn't work all the time. And then finally, the fourth thing that we kind of all acknowledge but then do nothing with is that pre-political or pre-decisional processes, those things that exist outside of politics, the way in which we consult with one another and the way in which we interact in the world, those are often the most critical things in determining what issues and alternatives are even viable in the political system. And if all we're talking about is what legislation gets proposed, we're ignoring a whole lot about the world that happens before that. So Cobb and Elder say if agenda setting is such an important topic that should be studied, what are these politics of agenda setting that make a difference? They argue that agenda setting is the kind of birthplace of policy issues, and that agenda has really two parts. There's the institutional agenda, which is what any political institution is willing to take up at any point in time. And then there's the systemic agenda. That is what society has kind of brought to the top of the issue world. What they argue about institutional agendas is that there's a lot of inertia, there's a lot of status quo maintenance, and they will always lag behind the systemic agenda. They are biased in that they tend to give precedence to issues that have been around longer, and they reflect the composition of the organization itself. So if the organization is Congress, and Congress looks white and older and wealthier, then the bias is going to be towards that type of worldview. Moreover, there is different responses to different groups that come to those organizations with grievances. Some groups are viewed as legitimate, and some groups are viewed as fringe. And I'm not even talking about kind of just politics and the left-right debate. I'm talking about who do we give our time to? Who do we hear out? And of course, what Cobb and Elder don't necessarily say, but is implied here and certainly falls into this, is money and influence. The systemic agenda is that pre-political agenda. This is always kind of more abstract. There's not always a fully fleshed out political agenda built into that systemic agenda. Instead, it's broader in scope, more general, and it is always wider than the institutional agenda. But the community standing of the group itself, or members of the group, matters. And we see this a lot when a member of a group is disgraced, that group often has to take on the burden of dealing with the fact that they had a member who did something wrong, right? And there is a lot of constraint and difficulty moving something from that pre-political stage, from that systemic agenda, to an institutional agenda. That can be as simple as the institution doesn't have the time or resources to deal with it. But it also can be because it doesn't want to. And this also comes into play with issues that we aren't sure whether it should be for government intervention. Is what is going on in society always worthy of government intervention? It probably depends on how your partisan feelings align. And I'm not just talking about political parties. I'm just talking broadly. What is your ideology about how the world should work? Do you think that the government should actively reduce sexism, ageism, racism, etc.? Or do you think that that's something that society needs to deal with, individuals and groups need to deal with, but the government does not need to deal with? At this point, this movement from the systemic agenda to the institutional agenda often involves whether government should deal with something at all. Ultimately, Cobb and Elder are arguing that political theorists, but policy scholars and practitioners as well, ignore these forces at their peril. That this connection between politics and agenda setting and the end policy result is way tighter than I think we give it credit for, and certainly what they would argue we give it credit for. Now, since this work, a lot has been done about agenda setting and about institutions and interest groups and all kinds of things. But you can still argue that we do ignore these things from time to time and focus really heavily on what government does and less on the forces below it. So that, in just under 12 minutes, is what Cobb and Elder are talking about. I hope this helps. I hope this helps kind of give some context to my notes and to the reading. It's a really good reading, and I would argue that if you haven't read it or you had trouble with it, go back and reread it, because it's going to inform a lot of what we do this semester. All right, that's all for now.